Far more than we think. Making Sense of Spirituality by Angelo. Chapter 6. Ego, Ergo, Ego. If the spiritual ideas that I've just outlined are so plausible, why did it take me so long to accept and understand them? Surely if it was that evident, I would have figured it all out a long time ago. I may not have the brain of Einstein, but I have a certain amount of intelligence and common sense. I like to think that I would not miss the blindingly obvious. Yet the fact is that I did miss it. I missed it despite all the prevailing wisdom available to me. I was so busy living the life that I thought I should be living that I ignored the signs because they didn't seem to serve me. Anything that didn't fit into my idea of the world was simply filed away in the weird but probably not true folder in my mind and left untouched. I wanted to be happy and fulfilled, yet somehow I was not. I was dissatisfied despite having all my material and emotional needs largely met. I was deeply unhappy. Yet it never occurred to me to embrace the weird but probably not true stuff because I thought I could solve the problems myself. This was the stumbling block. The problem was my ego. I was my own problem. My understanding of the term ego used to relate to arrogance and being big-headed, someone with a high opinion of himself who usually acts accordingly. It was a trait I used to find unpleasant, yet admirable at the same time. I'm sure we all know people who fit this category. We don't really like them, but we have a grudging respect for their achievements and self-confidence. An ego seemed to be what we needed in order to get on with life. I thought that having a bit of an ego was a good thing. My own ego was a confusing mixture of self-importance and low self-esteem, and the result was destructive self-criticism and a rather fearful and depressed nature that I tried to hide by pretending to be confident. What I now mean by ego is simply the strong identification we all have with ourselves. It is that unshakable belief in our own identity. We may not like everything about ourselves physically or behaviourally, but on balance we buy into our identity, particularly in light of our backgrounds and circumstances. My thinking was along these lines. I am who I am, and that is that. There are parts of me I cannot change even if I wanted to. I am my body and my mind. My thoughts and feelings define who I am. Things happen in my life, both good and bad, but ultimately I make the decisions and live with the consequences. I am in charge of my life. It's up to me to make myself happy. This is what I have come to understand to be an egocentric attitude. This egocentric view of life is self-centered. Self-centeredness is at the core of our lives. Selfish is thought of as a negative word, yet it seems inescapable. We accuse other people of being selfish, but deep down we have a basic survival instinct ourselves. We learn to cooperate with others in order to get what we want. Some of us do a lot of people pleasing in order to have our emotional and material needs met, and we wear various different masks depending on particular circumstances. These people, including me, want to be part of the crowd, and we find safety in being liked and admired and generally being normal. Others of us are more unique and delight in being different and radical. These folks will often deliberately go against the prevailing fashion in order to stand out and be noticed. Yet others define themselves by their status in society, either through their jobs, pursuits, or financial attributes. Success is of primary importance, and success needs to be visible to others in order to provide self-worth. And so it goes on, with different horses for different courses. Underlying all of these lives, and the many complex motives behind them, is the private, personal, undeniable sense of self. Ego rules our lives. This, I believe, is the experience of the great majority of people. It may not be the case for everyone, but it certainly was for me. Ego kept me from seeing the truth. The problematic ego is self-reinforcing. The mechanism seems to work whether we consider ourselves a success in life or a failure, or somewhere in between. The successful people are likely to believe in their own abilities and are likely to have financial security and generally will think they have made a pretty good job of life. The failures will doubt their own abilities and will probably struggle financially and may well have a low opinion of themselves. These are two ends of the spectrum, but most people will fit somewhere in between, being pleased with themselves about certain aspects of their lives and a bit down on themselves about other aspects. Whether we are a success, a failure, or somewhere in between, our experiences will reinforce our own sense of self. Good or bad, happy or sad, it all leads back to our own perception of who we are. It's an endless cycle of believing our own thoughts and feelings. The process is along these lines. I am myself, I experience myself as me, and therefore I am me. Ego, ergo, ego. Each of us has an ego, and our experience of life makes this ego stronger. But this is how it was for me, and I managed to completely avoid the whole subject of spirituality for decades. I ignored all of the warning signs. I was too wrapped up in myself to look elsewhere. It was not relevant for me for many years, and then gradually I had to face my own demons. My own experience involved stress, depression, heartbreak, loneliness, admission to a psychiatric hospital, alcoholism, a second stay in a psychiatric hospital, and then a slow recovery. I would not recommend this as the preferred path to spirituality, but that's how it was for me. My ego had taken enough of a battering over a period of time for me to finally be open to receive the wisdom that had always been there. Recovery meant deflating my ego and giving my spirit some room to breathe. One way to visualize this process is to see my ego as a giant beach ball and my spirit as a tiny squash ball. Once I became aware of the squash ball, I could gradually start to transfer air from one ball to the other. This was the equivalent of my spiritual awakening. The transfer of air has been and still is my subsequent spiritual growth. As the ego diminishes, so the awareness of spirit grows, and the more wonderful our perception and experience of the world becomes. It really is as simple as that. My purpose in writing about my experience is to show others that the squash ball really does exist, and perhaps to spare them the pain and suffering of having their own egos mangled by external events. The process of letting go of ego can be uncomfortable at times, but there's nothing to fear. The joys of progress far outweigh the challenges of growth. Fear is what stops us changing and growing, but fear resides in the ego. As we connect with spirit, so the fear subsides. The key to spiritual growth is to gradually let go of ego and embrace the underlying reality of who we really are. This can be done through various simple techniques that I will describe in section 4. It's not enough to just recognize that the ego needs to be diminished and then try to think it so. Understanding the problem will not be sufficient to bring about change. We can't simply decide to have less of an ego, because the ego will resist. Also, rather ironically, there is even ego in trying to be ego-less. The solution is to put in some action, but to let go of the outcome. The idea is firstly to be willing to allow things to change, and secondly to accept that the change will only happen when we put in the necessary action. A plant won't grow unless we provide it with nourishment and sunlight. A major component of ego is pride, and this can be a real barrier to progress. It's no coincidence that pride heads the list of the 7 deadly sins. Holding on to our ego turns out to be the biggest sin of all. Sin is a mistake to learn from rather than a crime to be punished. Our ego is the sin that keeps us from seeing the light of our own spirit. We seek happiness in our lives, but we do so from the position of ego, and this inevitably means we will never achieve peace and contentment on a permanent basis. It's when we let go of ego that lasting happiness occurs. Our ego is not who we are. The body and the ego mind are but a suit of clothes. Just as a caterpillar goes through a metamorphosis and becomes a beautiful butterfly, so too can we change and grow into something far more wonderful than we previously thought possible. Some will say they will only believe it when they see it. My experience has been that we see it when we believe it. The ego is not our enemy, it just needs to be right-sized. The ego performs a crucial role in ensuring our survival, but it will spiral out of control if left unchecked. The ego will not want to be challenged, and we will resist spiritual principles unless we can perceive the benefits. The ego will hold on to its own identity at all costs. Some may be feeling resistance right now, but that's perfectly natural and common. We just need to keep the potential benefits in mind and remain open-minded. All we need to do is to begin to allow our spirit to influence our ego mind. We will need to let go of the ego mind in order to find the spirit within. It makes sense, therefore, to try to gain some understanding of what our minds are up to.